In the elegant ballroom of Millbrook Country Club, a dutiful son was about to witness his worst nightmare unfold. What started as organizing his father's retirement celebration took a shocking turn when he came face to face with devastating public rejection. Marcus Thompson wasn't your typical construction company manager. For 10 years, he had spent his life sacrificing his architectural dreams to save the family business, known for his invisible dedication and unwavering loyalty. When he positioned himself prominently in the crowd, expecting recognition for his decade of sacrifice, he had no idea he was walking into emotional devastation. Marcus listened as his father thanked his real son, Jake, while looking right past him, a moment that would lead to the complete unraveling of everything he believed about family love. What began as a celebration of professional achievement would become a journey of self-discovery and family healing. The Thompson family would never be the same after Marcus finally stopped trying to earn love that should have been freely given. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus's hand trembled slightly as he adjusted the microphone. Stand for the third time. The ballroom at Millbrook Country Club buzzed with conversation, the sound echoing off crystal chandeliers and mahogany-paneled walls. Everything had to be perfect for his father's retirement celebration. Everything. He stepped back, surveying the room with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent 10 years managing details that others took for granted. The centerpieces, white roses and eucalyptus, his father's favorites, sat precisely centered on each table. The photo display chronicling David Thompson's 40-year construction career stood prominently near the entrance, each image carefully selected and mounted. Marcus had spent hours organizing it, choosing pictures that told the story of Thompson Construction's rise from a two-man operation to the region's premier building company. What the display didn't show were the sleepless nights Marcus had spent over spreadsheets during the 2008 recession, or the architecture degree gathering dust in his apartment, while he learned to read blueprints through a contractor's eyes instead of an artist's. Those sacrifices lived in the margins of the company's success story, invisible but essential. Marcus, the caterers need to know about the gluten-free options. Linda's voice carried the particular strain that accompanied family gatherings. His stepmother materialized beside him, smoothing her navy dress with nervous hands. At 64, Linda Stevens Thompson had perfected the art of maintaining appearances while anxiety ate at her from within. Already handled, Marcus replied, pulling out his phone to show her the detailed notes he'd shared with the catering manager. Mrs. Patterson from the bank has celiac, and Jim Morrison's wife is gluten-sensitive. I made sure they had alternatives marked clearly. Linda's relief was palpable, but it came with that familiar edge of surprise, as if his competence still caught her off guard after all these years. You think of everything. Your father is so lucky to have you managing the details. The words should have felt like praise. Instead, they settled in Marcus's chest like stones, managing details. That's what 35 years had amounted to. A supporting role in his father's story, essential but unremarkable. There's my boy, David. Thompson's voice boomed across the ballroom as Jake walked through the entrance, his girlfriend Emma beside him. At 32, Jake possessed the easy confidence of someone who'd never questioned his place in the world. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his smile genuine and bright as he approached their father. Marcus watched the reunion from his position, by the microphone, noting the way David's entire demeanor shifted. His father's shoulders straightened, his smile broadened, and he moved toward Jake with an energy that seemed to light him from within. The embrace between them lasted several heartbeats, long enough for Marcus to catalog the warmth, the genuine joy, the unguarded affection. "Dad, you look great," Jake said, stepping back to clasp David's shoulders. "Retirement suits you already." "Not retired yet," David laughed, but his eyes held the contentment of a man looking at his proudest achievement. "Still got 2 weeks left, but having my son here makes it feel real." The conversation flowed naturally between them, Jake recounting stories from his residency at Denver General, David asking detailed questions about cases and procedures. Marcus found himself drawn closer, caught in the gravity of their connection while remaining somehow outside its orbit. "Dr. Stevens Thompson," David announced to a group of approaching guests, his arm still around Jake's shoulders. "My son, the doctor, just finished his emergency medicine rotation. top of his class. Pride radiated from every word. Marcus had heard variations of this introduction dozens of times over the years. At company Christmas parties, Chamber of Commerce, events, casual encounters at the grocery store. Jake, the success story. Jake, the achievement worth celebrating. Marcus! Bobby Martinez's gravelly voice cut through Marcus's thoughts. At 70, David's longtime business partner moved with the deliberate pace of someone whose body carried decades of construction work, but his eyes remained sharp as ever. Those eyes held something Marcus couldn't quite identify. Sympathy, perhaps, or frustration. Hell of a party you've put together, Bobby said, accepting a beer from a passing server. Your old man's going to remember this night for years. That's the idea. Marcus adjusted his tie, a nervous habit he'd never managed to shake. He deserves to have everything perfect. Bobby's weathered face creased into something that wasn't quite a smile. 40 years we've worked together, and I've watched that man build something remarkable. But you know what I think about when I look at this company? Marcus waited, uncertain where the conversation was heading. I think about 2008, when the banks were calling in loans and half our competitors went under. Bobby's voice dropped lower, meant for Marcus alone. I think about who was working 18-hour days to keep us afloat, who gave up his own dreams to save what his father built. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow, not because they were untrue, but because they were so rarely spoken aloud. His throat tightened. It worked out, Marcus managed. The company survived. It did more than survive. It thrived. Because of you. Bobby's eyes held steady on Marcus's face. Don't think everybody's forgotten that, even if some people never properly acknowledged it. Before Marcus could respond, a familiar laugh drew his attention across the room. Sarah Chen had arrived, her black hair catching the light as she surveyed the crowd. 3 years ago, when Marcus had hired her as Thompson Construction's first staff architect, he'd told himself it was purely a business decision. The company needed someone who could bridge the gap between vision and execution, someone who understood both the artistry and practicality of building. What he hadn't anticipated was how Sarah would see through the family dynamics he'd spent years normalizing. She noticed things, the way conversations shifted when Marcus entered a room, how his suggestions were received differently than Jake's, the careful distance his father maintained even during moments of professional triumph. Sarah caught sight of him and headed over, navigating the crowd with the purposeful stride that had made her such an effective advocate for their clients. She wore a deep green dress that complemented her complexion, and Marcus felt the familiar flutter of attraction he'd been trying to ignore for months. The man of the hour, she said, reaching them. This is incredible, Marcus. The photo display alone must have taken days to organize. Marcus has always been good with the details, Bobby said, his tone carrying layers of meaning that Marcus hoped Sarah wouldn't pick up on. Details matter, Sarah replied, but her eyes remained on Marcus. They're what separate good work from exceptional work. Your father's lucky to have someone who cares so much about getting things right. The conversation continued around him, but Marcus found himself studying the room with new eyes. Guests clustered around Jake and David, drawn to their natural magnetism. Linda hovered nearby, ready to smooth over any awkward moments or fetch anything they needed. And Marcus stood apart, the organizer, the facilitator, the one who made everything possible while remaining somehow invisible. The irony wasn't lost on him. In 2 hours, when his father took the microphone to address the crowd, Marcus would finally have his moment. 10 years of sacrifice, of choosing the family business over his own dreams, of proving his worth through dedication and competence. It would all culminate in public recognition from the man whose approval he'd spent his entire life seeking. The microphone he'd adjusted so carefully would carry his father's words to every corner of the room. The guests he'd personally invited would hear David Thompson acknowledge the son who'd saved his legacy. The photo display would serve as a backdrop for the moment Marcus had been waiting for his entire adult life. He straightened his shoulders and checked his watch. Soon, the speeches would begin. Soon, his father would stand before their colleagues, friends, and family, and finally give Marcus the recognition he'd earned, the validation he deserved. The anticipation built in his chest like a rising tide, carrying with it 35 years of hope, sacrifice, and carefully contained longing. Tonight, everything would change. Tonight, his father would finally see him, really see him, and acknowledge the son who'd never stopped trying to earn his love. Part 2. The speech. Marcus's hand found the edge of a nearby table as the room gradually quieted. His father stood at the microphone, looking distinguished in his navy suit, silver hair catching the chandelier light. The moment Marcus had been anticipating for years was finally here. "Thank you all for being here tonight," David began, his voice carrying the natural authority that had made him successful in business. 40 years ago, I started Thompson Construction with nothing but a pickup truck, a toolbox, and more ambition than sense. Gentle laughter rippled through the crowd. Marcus positioned himself where his father could easily see him, straightening his tie one final time. His heart hammered against his ribs with the intensity of someone about to receive a long-awaited vindication. David's eyes swept the room as he continued. "I've been blessed to work alongside incredible people who've helped build this company into something I never could have imagined. Bobby Martinez, my partner and friend for 4 decades, who's taught me that integrity isn't just about doing the right thing when people are watching. It's about who you are when no one's looking." Bobby raised his beer in acknowledgement, but Marcus noticed his mentor's expression remained carefully neutral. Something flickered in Bobby's weathered features, a tension that seemed at odds with the celebratory moment. "I want to thank our clients who trusted us with their dreams, our subcontractors who've helped us turn blueprints into reality, our employees who've made Thompson Construction synonymous with quality and reliability." Marcus's chest swelled. This was it. The setup was perfect. Acknowledging the team before recognizing the family member who'd sacrificed everything to preserve the company legacy. "But most importantly," David continued, his voice growing warmer, "I want to thank my family. Linda, who stood by me through every challenge and celebrated every success." Linda beamed from her position near the front, clasping her hands together. David's gaze found her with genuine affection, and Marcus felt a familiar pang of envy at the ease of their connection. "And I want to especially thank my real son, Jake, for showing me what it means to make a father proud." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. His father's eyes had moved right past him, settling on Jake with unmistakable warmth and pride. Real son. The phrase echoed in Marcus's mind, each repetition driving the knife deeper. "Jake, you've achieved everything I could have hoped for and more. Watching you become a doctor, seeing the man you've grown into, it's been the greatest joy of my life. You've shown me that success isn't just about building something with your hands, but about healing people, about making a difference in ways I never could." Marcus's vision seemed to narrow, the room's sounds becoming distant and muffled. Around him, guests applauded. But he caught the uncomfortable glances, the subtle shifts in posture that suggested others had noticed the glaring omission. His legs felt unsteady, and he gripped the table harder. Jake's face had gone pale. "Dad, He started to interrupt, but David continued, lost in his own emotional momentum. "I know I haven't always been the father you deserved, son, but seeing you excel in everything you've touched, watching you follow your calling, it's taught me what real pride feels like, what it means to have a son who makes you better just by being who he is." The applause grew more scattered now, uncertainty creeping into the room's atmosphere. Marcus became aware of Sarah beside him, her hand reaching toward his arm, but he couldn't process her touch. Everything felt distant, underwater. Bobby's voice cut through the applause with unusual sharpness. "What about Marcus?" The question hung in the air like a dropped glass, creating a moment of crystalline silence. David blinked, seeming to surface. From his emotional reverie, his eyes finally finding Marcus in the crowd. For a heartbeat, father and son looked at each other across the room. Marcus saw something flicker in David's expression. Not recognition, but surprise, as if he'd forgotten Marcus was there at all. As if the son who'd spent a decade saving the family business was an afterthought in his own father's story. "Of course," David said quickly, his voice taking on the artificial tone of someone covering a mistake. "Marcus has been invaluable to the company. Really invaluable." The word hung there, clinical and distant. Invaluable. Like a piece of reliable equipment. Not beloved, not cherished. Invaluable. Marcus's face burned with humiliation as he realized the entire room was now watching him, waiting for his reaction. Some faces showed sympathy, others curiosity, still others the uncomfortable fascination people felt when witnessing someone else's private pain made public. Jake stepped forward, his face stricken. "Dad, maybe we should—" "Thank you," Marcus interrupted, his voice surprisingly steady despite the chaos in his chest. "Excuse me." He turned and walked toward the exit, each step feeling mechanical and strange. Behind him, he heard Linda's voice rise in pitch as she attempted damage. "Control. Of course David appreciates everything Marcus has done. This is just such an emotional night, isn't it? So many memories." Sarah's footsteps followed him, her heels clicking against the marble floor. "Marcus, wait." He pushed through the ballroom doors into the country club's quiet foyer, the sudden silence after the party's noise feeling like a slap. The grandfather clock in the corner marked 8:47 p.m. Less than an hour ago, he'd been adjusting that microphone, full of anticipation for this moment. "Marcus." Sarah caught up to him, her voice gentle but firm. "Stop." He turned to face her, and the concern in her eyes nearly broke him. "Did you hear that? Did you hear what he said?" "I heard." Her voice carried controlled anger. "I heard exactly what he said, and what he didn't say. Real son." In the elegant ballroom of Millbrook Country Club, a dutiful son was about to witness his worst nightmare unfold. What started as organizing his father's retirement celebration took a shocking turn when he came face to face with devastating public rejection. Marcus Thompson wasn't your typical construction company manager. For 10 years, he had spent his life sacrificing his architectural dreams to save the family business, known for his invisible dedication and unwavering loyalty. When he positioned himself prominently in the crowd, expecting recognition for his decade of sacrifice, he had no idea he was walking into emotional devastation. Marcus listened as his father thanked his real son, Jake, while looking right past him, a moment that would lead to the complete unraveling of everything he believed about family love. What began as a celebration of professional achievement would become a journey of self-discovery and family healing. The Thompson family would never be the same after Marcus finally stopped trying to earn love that should have been freely given. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus's hand trembled slightly as he adjusted the microphone. Stand for the third time. The ballroom at Millbrook Country Club buzzed with conversation, the sound echoing off crystal chandeliers and mahogany-paneled walls. Everything had to be perfect for his father's retirement celebration. Everything. He stepped back, surveying the room with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent 10 years managing details that others took for granted. The centerpieces, white roses and eucalyptus, his father's favorites, sat precisely centered on each table. The photo display chronicling David Thompson's 40-year construction career stood prominently near the entrance, each image carefully selected and mounted. Marcus had spent hours organizing it, choosing pictures that told the story of Thompson Construction's rise from a two-man operation to the region's premier building company. What the display didn't show were the sleepless nights Marcus had spent over spreadsheets during the 2008 recession, or the architecture degree gathering dust in his apartment, while he learned to read blueprints through a contractor's eyes instead of an artist's. Those sacrifices lived in the margins of the company's success story, invisible but essential. "Marcus, the caterers need to know about the gluten-free options." Linda's voice carried the particular strain that accompanied family gatherings. His stepmother materialized beside him, smoothing her navy dress with nervous hands. At 64, Linda Stevens Thompson had perfected the art of maintaining appearances while anxiety ate at her from within. "Already handled," Marcus replied, pulling out his phone to show her the detailed notes he'd shared with the catering manager. "Mrs. Patterson from the bank has celiac, and Jim Morrison's wife is gluten-sensitive. I made sure they had alternatives marked clearly." Linda's relief was palpable, but it came with that familiar edge of surprise, as if his competence still caught her off guard after all these years. "You think of everything. Your father is so lucky to have you managing the details." The words should have felt like praise. Instead, they settled in Marcus's chest like stones. Managing details. That's what 35 years had amounted to. a supporting role in his father's story, essential but unremarkable. "There's my boy!" David. Thompson's voice boomed across the ballroom as Jake walked through the entrance, his girlfriend Emma beside him. At 32, Jake possessed the easy confidence of someone who'd never questioned his place in the world. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his smile genuine and bright as he approached their father. Marcus watched the reunion from his position, by the microphone, noting the way David's entire demeanor shifted. His father's shoulders straightened, his smile broadened, and he moved toward Jake with an energy that seemed to light him from within. The embrace between them lasted several heartbeats, long enough for Marcus to catalog the warmth, the genuine joy, the unguarded affection. "Dad, you look great," Jake said, stepping back to clasp David's shoulders. "Retirement suits you already." "Not retired yet," David laughed, but his eyes held the contentment of a man looking at his proudest achievement. "Still got 2 weeks left, but having my son here makes it feel real." The conversation flowed naturally between them, Jake recounting stories from his residency at Denver General, David asking detailed questions about cases and procedures. Marcus found himself drawn closer, caught in the gravity of their connection while remaining somehow outside its orbit. "Dr. Stevens Thompson," David announced to a group of approaching guests, his arm still around Jake's shoulders. "My son, the doctor, just finished his emergency medicine rotation. Top of his class." Pride radiated from every word. Marcus had heard variations of this introduction dozens of times over the years. At company Christmas parties, Chamber of Commerce, events, casual encounters at the grocery store. Jake, the success story. Jake, the achievement worth celebrating. "Marcus!" Bobby Martinez's gravelly voice cut through Marcus's thoughts. At 70, David's longtime business partner moved with the deliberate pace of someone whose body carried decades of construction work, but his eyes remained sharp as ever. Those eyes held something Marcus couldn't quite identify. Sympathy, perhaps, or frustration. "Hell of a party you've put together," Bobby said, accepting a beer from a passing server. "Your old man's going to remember this night for years." "That's the idea." Marcus adjusted his tie, a nervous habit he'd never managed to shake. "He deserves to have everything perfect." Bobby's weathered face creased into something that wasn't quite a smile. 40 years we've worked together, and I've watched that man build something remarkable. But you know what I think about when I look at this company?" Marcus waited, uncertain where the conversation was heading. "I think about 2008, when the banks were calling in loans and half our competitors went under." Bobby's voice dropped lower, meant for Marcus alone. "I think about who was working 18-hour days to keep us afloat. Who gave up his own dreams to save what his father built." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow, not because they were untrue, but because they were so rarely spoken aloud. His throat tightened. "It worked out," Marcus managed. "The company survived. It did more than survive. It thrived. Because of you." Bobby's eyes held steady on Marcus's face. "Don't think everybody's forgotten that, even if some people never properly acknowledged it." Before Marcus could respond, a familiar laugh drew his attention across the room. Sarah Chen had arrived, her black hair catching the light as she surveyed the crowd. 3 years ago, when Marcus had hired her as Thompson Construction's first staff architect, he'd told himself it was purely a business decision. The company needed someone who could bridge the gap between vision and execution, someone who understood both the artistry and practicality of building. What he hadn't anticipated was how Sarah would see through the family dynamics he'd spent years normalizing. She noticed things, the way conversations shifted when Marcus entered a room, how his suggestions were received differently than Jake's, the careful distance his father maintained even during moments of professional triumph. Sarah caught sight of him and headed over, navigating the crowd with the purposeful stride that had made her such an effective advocate for their clients. She wore a deep green dress that complemented her complexion, and Marcus felt the familiar flutter of attraction he'd been trying to ignore for months. "The man of the hour," she said, reaching them. "This is incredible, Marcus. The photo display alone must have taken days to organize." "Marcus has always been good with the details," Bobby said, his tone carrying layers of meaning that Marcus hoped Sarah wouldn't pick up on. "Details matter," Sarah replied, but her eyes remained on Marcus. "They're what separate good work from exceptional work." Your father's lucky to have someone who cares so much about getting things right." The conversation continued around him, but Marcus found himself studying the room with new eyes. Guests clustered around Jake and David, drawn to their natural magnetism. Linda hovered nearby, ready to smooth over any awkward moments or fetch anything they needed. And Marcus stood apart, the organizer, the facilitator, the one who made everything possible while remaining somehow invisible. The words tasted bitter. 35 years, and I'm not his real son. You know that's not... It is, though. Marcus ran his hands through his hair, disturbing the careful styling he'd spent time on earlier. It's exactly what it is. I've been fooling myself, thinking that if I just worked hard enough, sacrificed enough, proved myself enough times, he'd finally see me the way he sees Jake. Through the ballroom doors, they could hear David attempting to continue his speech, his voice slightly strained as he tried to recapture the earlier warmth. Linda's nervous laughter punctuated his words like anxious music. 10 years, Marcus continued, his voice rising slightly. 10 years I gave to that company. I gave up architecture school. I gave up my own dreams. I worked 18-hour days, during the recession while Jake was in college, completely insulated from any of it. And tonight, in front of everyone we know, he makes it clear that none of it mattered. Sarah moved closer, her presence solid and grounding. It mattered to other people. Bobby knows what you did. I know what you've done. The employees know. But not him. Marcus's voice cracked. Never him. The sound of applause drifted from the ballroom as David apparently concluded his speech. Soon, people would come looking for them, full of awkward sympathy and careful words. The thought of facing those pitying glances, of accepting condolences for his public humiliation, made Marcus's stomach turn. I need to go, he said abruptly. I'll drive you, Sarah replied without hesitation. You don't have to. Yes, I do. Her tone brooked no argument. You're not going through this alone. As they headed toward the exit, Marcus caught a glimpse of himself in the foyer's ornate mirror. He looked exactly the same as he had 2 hours ago, but everything felt fundamentally different. The man looking back at him was someone who'd finally received the answer to a question he'd been asking his entire life. He wasn't his father's real son. He never had been. And perhaps more devastating than the public rejection was the growing realization that he'd spent 35 years trying to earn something that was never going to be offered freely. The country club's heavy doors closed behind them, muffling the party that continued without them. In the distance, Marcus could hear Jake's voice raised in what sounded like an argument, but the words were lost to the evening air. For the first time in years, Marcus walked away from a family gathering, without looking back. Marcus's hand trembled as he reached for his coffee cup, the ceramic surface cold despite sitting on the kitchen counter for the past hour. Sunlight streamed through his apartment windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny fragments of the life he'd thought he understood just 12 hours ago. He hadn't slept. Every time he'd closed his eyes, he heard his father's voice. My real son, Jake. The words had played on an endless loop, each repetition stripping away another layer of the careful story he'd told himself about his place in the family. His phone buzzed for the 7th time since dawn. Jake's name appeared on the screen again, followed by another missed call notification. Marcus let it ring until it stopped, then watched as a new voicemail notification appeared alongside the 4 others he hadn't listened to. The apartment felt smaller than usual, its familiar comfort transformed into something that pressed against his chest with each breath. He'd lived here for 5 years, choosing the space for its proximity to construction sites, rather than any particular attachment to the neighborhood. Now he wondered if that choice, like so many others, had been made in service of a family that saw him as little more than a useful tool. A knock at the door interrupted his spiraling thoughts. Marcus considered ignoring it. He wasn't ready to face Jake's guilt or Linda's frantic attempts at damage control. But the knock came again, followed by Sarah's voice. Marcus, I brought coffee. The real stuff. Not whatever you're probably trying to survive on. He opened the door to find her holding a cardboard tray with 2 large cups and a brown bag that smelled like fresh pastries. She wore jeans and a soft gray sweater, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. The contrast to her elegant appearance at the party made something in his chest loosen slightly. You didn't have to. Yes, I did. She stepped past him into the apartment, setting the coffee and food on his small dining table. And before you start with the polite protests, I'm not leaving until we talk about what happened last night. Marcus closed the door and leaned against it, watching as she unpacked breakfast with the same efficient care she brought to everything else. There's not much to talk about. My father made his feelings clear. Your father made his damage clear, Sarah corrected, turning to face him. There's a difference. She'd been thinking about this, he realized. The precision in her words, the way she'd come prepared with both sustenance and determination. She'd spent her sleepless night analyzing the situation with the same thoroughness she applied to architectural problems. Sarah, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but nothing. Her voice carried an edge he'd rarely heard. Sit down, eat something, and stop making excuses for behavior that was inexcusable. The firmness in her tone caught him off guard. For 3 years, their professional relationship had been built on mutual respect and careful boundaries. Even as their personal connection had deepened, they'd maintained a certain formality. This was different, raw and immediate in a way that stripped away pretense. Marcus sat at the table, accepting the coffee she pressed into his hands. The warmth felt good against his palms, grounding him in the present moment. I keep thinking about all the times I made excuses for him, he said quietly. Every Christmas when he'd light up talking about Jake's achievements and barely acknowledge mine. Every company event where he'd introduce Jake as his son and me as… What? The guy who handles things? You're not responsible for his emotional failures, Sarah said, settling across from him. You've been trying to earn something that should have been freely given. But maybe if I'd… Stop. The word came out sharp enough to make him look up at her. What you're doing right now. This is what children of emotionally negligent parents do. We blame ourselves for not being good enough to earn basic love and recognition. The word "we" hung in the air between them. Marcus studied her face, seeing something he'd missed before, a familiarity with pain that went beyond professional sympathy. My father left when I was 12, Sarah continued, her voice softer now. Not physically. He still lived in the house, went to work, paid the bills. But emotionally, he checked out completely after my mother's second miscarriage. I spent years trying to be perfect enough to bring him back. Straight A's, perfect behavior, never asking for anything I didn't absolutely need. She reached across the table, her fingers briefly touching his wrist. It took me years to understand that his withdrawal wasn't about me. It was about his inability to process grief and disappointment. But by then, I'd trained myself to believe that love was something you had to earn through achievement and self-sacrifice. Marcus felt something crack open in his chest, a recognition so profound it left him breathless. How do you stop? How do you stop trying to earn something that's never going to come? You start by acknowledging the truth about what happened. You stop minimizing it, stop making excuses for it, and you call it what it is. Before he could respond, another knock echoed through the apartment. This one was heavier, more insistent. Bobby Martinez's voice followed. Marcus, open up. We need to talk. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Do you want me to… No, stay. The words came out more forcefully than he'd intended. Please, I need someone here who sees this clearly. Bobby entered the apartment like a man on a mission, his weathered face set in grim lines. At 70, he moved with the deliberate purpose of someone who'd finally decided to speak truths that had been too long buried. 40 years, Bobby said without preamble, accepting the coffee Sarah offered him. 40 years I've watched that man treat you like an afterthought in your own family. Marcus felt his carefully maintained composure begin to crumble. Bobby, no, you're going to listen. You think last night was the first time I've seen him ignore your contributions? I watched him take credit for your ideas in board meetings. I've seen him dismiss your suggestions only to embrace them when they came from someone else. I've watched him introduce Jake as his son and you as his employee to the same group of people in the same conversation. The older man's voice carried decades of suppressed frustration. You know what you were doing at 25 when you gave up architecture school? You were saving his ass. The company was hemorrhaging money, and he was too proud to admit he didn't know how to stop the bleeding. You did that. You learned every aspect of the business, worked connections he'd let lapse, made the hard decisions he couldn't face. The recession hit everyone. The recession buried our competitors, Bobby interrupted. We not only survived, we came out stronger. Because of the systems you put in place, the relationships you rebuilt, the 18-hour days you put in, while he was playing golf and pretending everything was fine. Sarah leaned forward, her eyes sharp with understanding. He never acknowledged any of this? Bobby's laugh was bitter. He rewrote history. Ask him now. He'll tell you the company's success was due to his leadership and vision. Marcus's contributions have been erased from the story he tells about himself. Marcus's phone buzzed again. Linda's name this time. He declined the call, but not before Bobby noticed. Let me guess. Linda's trying to explain it all away. Tell you he didn't mean it like that you're being too sensitive. The accuracy of Bobby's prediction was startling. Marcus nodded, feeling exposed. She's been enabling this behavior for 27 years, Bobby continued. Making excuses, smoothing things over, asking you to understand instead of demanding he do better. She's not protecting your family. She's protecting a dysfunction that's been eating at you your whole life. A new voicemail notification appeared, followed immediately by another call from Jake. This time, Marcus answered. We need to talk. Jake's voice was tight with distress. I'm coming over. Jake, I don't think... I'm already in your parking lot. The line went dead. Within minutes, Jake was at the door, his usual confident demeanor replaced by something Marcus had rarely seen in his younger brother, genuine vulnerability. I didn't know, Jake said as soon as he entered the apartment. I swear to you, Marcus, I didn't know he was going to say that. But you're not surprised he did, Bobby observed, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd watched this family dynamic play out for decades. Jake's face crumpled slightly. No, I'm not surprised. And that's the problem, isn't it? I've known for years that he treats you differently, and I told myself it didn't matter because you seemed okay with it. I normalized it, Marcus said quietly. I made it easy for everyone to pretend it wasn't happening. I used to think you were just more mature than me, Jake continued, slumping into the remaining chair. Less needy for attention. I told myself you didn't mind that he bragged about me and not you because you were secure in yourself. Sarah's voice cut through the moment with surgical precision. That's a convenient lie that let you enjoy the favoritism without guilt. Jake flinched but didn't argue. You're right. I was selfish. I liked being the golden child, and I didn't want to examine what that meant for Marcus. The admission hung in the air, raw and uncomfortable. Marcus found himself studying his brother's face, seeing something he'd missed before. The weight Jake carried from benefiting from a system he'd never questioned. Last night, when he said those words, Jake continued, I watched your face. I saw what I'd been pretending not to see for years, the hope you had, and how completely he destroyed it. Bobby set down his coffee cup with a decisive click. So what are you going to do about it? All of you? The question forced Marcus to confront something he'd been avoiding since leaving. The party. What came next? How do you rebuild a sense of self after discovering that your fundamental understanding of your place in the world was wrong? I can't go back to the company, Marcus said, the words surprising him with their certainty. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Marcus, you can't just... Jake started. Yes, I can. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus felt the power of setting a boundary. I can't pretend this didn't happen. I can't go back to being grateful for scraps of attention and calling it family love. Sarah reached for his hand across the table. What do you need right now? The question was simple, but it hit him like a revelation. When had anyone asked him what he needed? When had he allowed himself to consider his own needs as legitimate? Time, he said slowly. Space to figure out who I am, when I'm not trying to earn his approval. The Daniels project needs your attention this week, Jake said quietly. The structural engineer has questions about the foundation modifications. Then you'll have to handle it, Marcus replied. Or Dad will. Or you'll figure it out together. The company existed before I sacrificed my life for it, and it'll exist after. Bobby's weathered face split into something that might have been pride. About damn time you put yourself first. As the morning wore on, Marcus felt something shifting inside him, a fundamental realignment of priorities that felt both terrifying and liberating. For the first time in years, He was choosing his own emotional well-being over his family's comfort. It was a small act of rebellion, but it felt like the beginning of something larger. The beginning of a life lived for himself rather than in service of a love that had never been freely offered. Marcus's hand rested on the warm stone of his mother's headstone, the granite surface heated by 3 days of October sun. Elena Maria Thompson, 1960–1992, beloved wife and mother. He'd driven here on impulse after his second therapy session with Dr. Patricia Nguyen, following an instinct he couldn't fully explain. "I'm sorry I haven't been here in so long," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the cemetery's rustling leaves. "I kept meaning to come, but there was always something at the company that needed attention." A memory surfaced. 8-year-old Marcus asking his father when they would visit Mommy's grave, and David's face closing off like a door slamming shut. "We remember her at home," had been his father's response, delivered in the tone that meant the subject was permanently closed. Now, at 35, Marcus wondered how many of his mother's stories had been buried along with her. How much of himself had he lost by accepting his father's silence about the woman who'd given him life? His phone buzzed insistently. The 4th call from Thompson Construction this morning. He'd been officially absent for a week now, and the cracks in the company's facade were apparently starting to show. 3 miles away, chaos reigned at the construction office. David Thompson stood in the main workspace, staring at a computer screen displaying the project management software that Marcus had implemented 5 years ago. The interface might as well have been written in hieroglyphics. "Where the hell is the Daniels file?" David muttered, clicking through folders with the frustrated determination of someone who'd always had others handle the details. Sarah appeared, beside his desk, her professional demeanor masking the exhaustion that came from 3 sleepless nights trying to cover Marcus's responsibilities alongside her own. "It's in the active projects folder, under D for Daniels. But the structural engineer isn't looking for the file. He needs Marcus's notes about the foundation modification. Those are in his personal system." "Personal system?" David's voice rose slightly. "What personal system?" "The one he developed to track all the details you never wanted to deal with," Sarah replied, her tone carefully neutral, despite the edge of frustration building behind her professional facade. Jake burst through the office doors, still wearing scrubs from his hospital shift. He'd been splitting time between his residency and the company for 4 days now, trying to plug holes in operations he'd never realized existed. "The Morrison project is in crisis," he announced without preamble. "The client is threatening to pull out because we missed the delivery deadline for the custom windows." Apparently, Marcus had been personally coordinating with 3 different suppliers to make sure everything arrived on schedule. David's face darkened. "We have a project manager. Why wasn't he handling the Morrison account?" "Because Marcus was handling 6 major accounts personally," Sarah said, consulting the notes she'd been frantically compiling since Marcus's absence began. "Morrison, Daniels, the Civic Center renovation, the West Side development, the Patterson House, and the new library. He was also managing supplier relationships, handling permit issues, and apparently serving as backup for every department when problems arose." "That's impossible," David protested. "I would have known if he was doing all that." Jake and Sarah exchanged a look that spoke volumes about their growing understanding of the family dynamics they'd been witnessing. "He never told you because you never asked," Jake said quietly. "When did you last sit down with Marcus to discuss his actual responsibilities versus his job description?" David's silence was answer enough. Bobby Martinez appeared in the doorway, his weathered face set in the grim lines that had become his default expression since the retirement party. "David, we need to talk. Privately." The 2 men retreated to David's office, where 40 years of partnership was about to face its greatest test. "I can't run this company without Marcus," David said, collapsing into his chair. "I didn't realize how much he was handling." "You didn't realize because you didn't want to see it," Bobby replied, his voice carrying 4 decades of suppressed frustration. "You were content to let him carry the load as long as you could take credit for the results." "That's not. It's exactly what happened." Bobby's tone cut through David's attempted deflection. "And now you're facing the consequences of treating your son like an invisible employee for the past 10 years. David's jaw tightened. "He chose to take on those responsibilities. I never asked him to." You never asked him to do anything, Bobby interrupted. You just expected it. Expected him to sacrifice his dreams, his personal life, his own ambitions to keep your company afloat. And when he did exactly that, you treated it like it was nothing. Relief flickered across David's features. I'm glad you see it that way. Now, about the Morrison account. No. The word hung in the air between them, simple and immovable. David blinked, clearly not having expected this response. No, it wasn't a misunderstanding. And no, I'm not coming back to clean up your mess. Marcus pushed away from the door, moving to the center of his living room. You said exactly what you meant to say, Dad. You thanked your real son. You made it crystal clear where I stand in your hierarchy of affection. David's professional mask began to slip. You're being dramatic, Marcus. You know I consider you. What? What do you consider me? Marcus's voice rose slightly, carrying an edge that surprised them both. Because from where I was standing, listening to you gush about Jake's achievements while completely ignoring my existence, it seemed pretty clear what you consider me. You're my son. Am I? The question exploded out of Marcus with years of suppressed pain behind it. Because sons get acknowledged at their father's retirement party. Sons get introduced with pride, not as an afterthought when someone else points out the oversight. Sons don't have to beg for scraps of attention while watching their brother get unconditional love. David's face flushed. Jake has never asked me for anything. He's made his own way, achieved success on his own merits. Jake has never had to ask for anything because you gave it freely. Marcus's voice cracked with emotion. Do you know what I was doing when Jake was earning his degree? I was working 60-hour weeks to save your company from bankruptcy. Do you know what I gave up? Architecture school, my own dreams, any chance at a life outside this family's dysfunction. No one forced you to. You're right, no one forced me. I chose to sacrifice everything because I thought if I worked hard enough, if I proved myself valuable enough, you might finally look at me the way you look at him. David's hands clenched at his sides. I've always appreciated your contributions to the company. Appreciated. Marcus laughed bitterly. There's that word again. You appreciate my contributions the way you'd appreciate a reliable piece of equipment. But you love Jake. You're proud of Jake. Jake makes you light up when you talk about him. That's not. It's exactly true, and we both know it. Marcus moved closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. Tell me about the last time you bragged about me to your friends. Tell me about the last time you called me just to check in. Not because you needed something for the company. Tell me about the last time you looked at me and felt proud to be my father. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of 35 years of unspoken truths. David's mouth opened and closed, but no words came. You can't, can you? Marcus continued. Because it's never happened. I've been invisible in my own family my entire life, and the only time anyone notices is when I stop performing my assigned role. David's defensive walls began to crumble, revealing something raw underneath. You don't understand what it's been like. Then explain it to me. Explain why your biological son isn't real enough to deserve basic acknowledgement. Explain why Jake gets unconditional love while I get conditional appreciation. You look just like her. The words erupted from David with volcanic force, surprising them both. Every day you look more like Elena, and every day it's like looking at my failure all over again. The admission hung in the air like a dropped bomb. Marcus felt the breath leave his lungs as pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known existed began falling into place. What failure? His voice was barely a whisper. David's face had gone ashen, as if he'd revealed something he'd never intended to speak aloud. Nothing. Forget I said anything. No. Marcus's voice grew stronger. What failure? What does my mother's death have to do with how you've treated me? It has nothing to do with— Stop lying! The shout echoed through the apartment. For once in your life, stop hiding behind deflection and tell me the truth. David collapsed into Marcus's armchair as if his strings had been cut. For the first time in Marcus's memory, his father looked old. Not distinguished or successful, but genuinely old and broken. I was driving, David said quietly, his voice stripped of all its usual authority. The night she died, we'd been fighting. About God, I can't even remember what it was about now. Something stupid. Money, probably. Or the business. I was driving too fast, angry, not paying attention the way I should have been. Marcus felt the room tilt around him. You were driving. You told me it was someone else. You said a drunk driver. I lied. David's voice was barely audible. There was another car involved, but the accident was my fault. I'm grateful for his contributions. Grateful? Bobby's voice rose for the first time in years. You introduced Jake as your son and Marcus as your employee at the same damn party. You want to talk about grateful? Show me where that gratitude was when it mattered. Meanwhile, Marcus sat in Dr. Patricia Nguyen's office, struggling to articulate feelings he'd spent decades suppressing. The therapist's office was deliberately calming. Soft lighting, neutral colors, tissues strategically placed within reach. Tell me about the patterns you're noticing, Dr. Nguyen said gently. How long have you been making yourself smaller to accommodate your family's dysfunction? I don't know if I'd call it dysfunction, Marcus began automatically, then caught himself. Actually, that's exactly what I keep doing, isn't it? Making excuses for behavior that hurt me. It's a survival mechanism, Dr. Nguyen explained. Children in emotionally neglectful families learn to minimize their own needs to maintain whatever connection they can with their caregivers. The problem is that these patterns persist into adulthood, even when they're no longer serving you. Marcus's phone buzzed with yet another call from the company. He declined it without looking. I keep thinking about all the times I told myself he was just busy or stressed, or that showing emotion wasn't his way, Marcus continued. But the truth is, he had plenty of emotion for Jake. Plenty of time to celebrate Jake's achievements, plenty of energy to be proud when it came to Jake. What does that tell you? That it was never about his capacity for emotion. It was about his willingness to direct that emotion toward me. The revelation hung in the air between them, simple and devastating in its clarity. Back at Thompson, construction, Linda arrived with a casserole and the desperate energy of someone trying to fix the unfixable through traditional means. I thought I'd bring lunch, she announced brightly, though her smile couldn't quite hide the anxiety that had been eating at her for days. And I wanted to discuss having everyone over for dinner this weekend. I think if we all just sit down together. Linda, Sarah interrupted gently. Marcus isn't answering calls from the company. What makes you think he'll come to a family dinner? This is all just a misunderstanding, Linda insisted, her voice taking on the slightly manic quality that accompanied her most determined peacemaking efforts. David didn't mean what Marcus thinks he meant. If we could all just talk it through. What exactly did he mean? Jake asked, looking up from the scheduling crisis he'd been trying to solve. Because from where I was standing, it sounded like he was making a pretty clear distinction between his real son and his not real son. Linda's face crumpled slightly. David loves Marcus. He's just not good at expressing it. He's perfectly good at expressing love when it comes to Jake, Sarah pointed out. This isn't about David's emotional limitations. This is about his choices. The truth was becoming impossible to ignore, even for Linda. The careful fiction she'd maintained for 27 years, that David treated both boys equally, that Marcus was simply more independent and needed less attention, was crumbling under the weight of evidence. As the day wore on, the scope of Marcus's contributions became increasingly clear. Client calls went unanswered because no one knew which. Projects required immediate attention. Supplier relationships that had taken years to build began showing strain as communications broke down. The smooth operation that had been Thompson Construction's hallmark revealed itself to be almost entirely dependent on one person's invisible labor. By evening, David faced a reality he'd been avoiding for a decade. The son he'd taken for granted was the foundation upon which his success had been built, and that son was nowhere to be found. The company's crisis was no longer just operational. It was existential. Without Marcus, Thompson Construction wasn't just missing an employee. It was missing its essential organizing principle, the person who had quietly held everything together while others took credit for the results. And somewhere across town, Marcus was learning that healing meant more than just identifying the problem. It meant developing the strength to demand better, even when that demand might cost him everything he'd thought he wanted. Marcus's hand paused over his coffee cup when the knock came. He'd been expecting it for days, the inevitable moment when his father's desperation would override his pride. Through the peephole, David Thompson stood in the hallway, his usually immaculate appearance slightly disheveled, his jaw set in the stubborn line that had characterized their relationship for as long as Marcus could remember. "I know you're in there, Marcus." David's voice carried through the door, formal and controlled despite the circumstances. "We need to talk about the company." Of course. Not about the retirement party, not about the devastating public humiliation, but about the company. Marcus opened the door, noting how his father's eyes immediately scanned the apartment as if assessing territory rather than visiting his son's home. "Dad." The word felt strange in his mouth after 10 days of silence. "You look tired," David observed, stepping past Marcus without invitation. He wore his typical uniform of pressed khakis and a button-down shirt, but the creases weren't as sharp as usual, and there was a tightness around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. "I've been sleeping fine, actually." Marcus closed the doctor and leaned against it, creating physical distance between them. "What do you want?" David turned, his expression shifting into the professional mask he wore during difficult business negotiations. "The Morrison project is falling apart. Jake's been trying to manage it, but he doesn't have your background with the suppliers. The client is threatening to pull out. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." "Then handle it yourself. You ran the company for 30 years before I came along." "That's not—" David stopped himself, visibly regrouping. "Look, I understand you're upset about the other night. Maybe I could have chosen my words more carefully." The casual dismissal hit Marcus like a physical blow. "More carefully?" "The retirement speech. I was emotional, caught up in the moment. You know how these things go. You get up there. You're thinking about family, about legacy, and sometimes the words don't come out exactly as you intended." Marcus stared at his father, watching the familiar dance of deflection and minimization. For 35 years, he'd participated in this choreography, accepting half-hearted explanations and moving on for the sake of family peace. But Dr. Nguyen's voice echoed in his mind. "What would it look like to stop making excuses for behavior that hurts you?" "So it was a misunderstanding?" Marcus asked quietly. "Exactly." Boxes lined the small space, each carefully labeled in his father's precise handwriting. Elena's books, Elena's clothes, Elena's art supplies. Marcus lifted the lid of the art box with reverence, revealing tubes of paint, brushes, and a stack of canvases. His mother had been an artist, something he'd known but never fully appreciated until he saw the evidence of her creative life. The paintings took his breath away. Watercolor landscapes filled with light and movement, detailed sketches of him as a toddler, and toward the bottom of the stack, a series of darker works that seemed to chronicle growing emotional distance. One painting in particular made Marcus's chest tighten. It showed a man and woman sitting at opposite ends of a dinner table, the space between them vast and cold despite the warm colors of the room. The woman's face, his mother's face, held an expression of profound loneliness. "She knew," Sarah said quietly, studying the painting over his shoulder. She could see what was happening to their marriage. Marcus found a small journal tucked between the canvases, its pages filled with his mother's handwriting. The early entries were full of hope and excitement about marriage and motherhood. But as the dates progressed, the tone shifted. "David's been distant lately," read one entry from 6 months before the accident. "He comes home stressed from work and seems to retreat into himself. I try to talk to him about it, but he says everything's fine. I'm starting to feel like I'm living with a stranger." Another entry, dated just weeks before her death. "Had another fight about money tonight. The business is struggling more than David wants to admit, and he's taking it out on everyone around him. Marcus asked why Daddy seems angry all the time. I didn't know what to tell him. How do you explain to a child that sometimes love isn't enough to fix what's broken?" The journal entries painted a picture of a marriage under stress, of a woman trying desperately to reach a husband who was pulling away emotionally. Marcus could see the pattern that would later repeat with him. David's tendency to withdraw when faced with emotional difficulties. his inability to communicate about problems until they reached crisis proportions. "Marcus?" Jake's voice came from the storage unit entrance. "Sarah told me I might find you here." Marcus looked up from the journal, noting his brother's hospital scrubs and the exhaustion that had become a permanent fixture on Jake's face since he'd started trying to manage the company. "I need to understand what happened to our family," Marcus said simply. "What happened to turn Dad into someone who could emotionally abandon his own son?" Jake stepped into the storage unit, his eyes taking in the paintings and documents scattered around them. "Can I help? I've been trying to piece things together too, and I think I know someone who might have answers." An hour later, the three of them sat in Bobby Martinez's living room, surrounded by photo albums and newspaper clippings the older man had been reluctant to share. "Your father wasn't the same after the accident," Bobby said, his voice heavy, with the weight of secrets he'd carried for nearly 3 decades. He blamed himself completely. Stopped eating, stopped sleeping, could barely function at work. Bobby pulled out a newspaper clipping from 2 weeks after Elena's death. The headline read, "Local businessman's wife dies in traffic accident." Below it was a photo of David at the funeral, his face gaunt and hollow. "I've never seen a man so destroyed by guilt," Bobby continued. He kept saying he'd killed the only good thing in his life, that he didn't deserve to be Marcus's father anymore because he'd taken away the boy's mother. "So he married Linda," Sarah said, understanding beginning to dawn. 18 months later, Bobby confirmed. It wasn't love, not the way it had been with Elena. It was desperation. He thought if he could create a new family, a fresh start, maybe he could function as a father again. Jake leaned forward, his face pale. But he couldn't be a father to Marcus because Marcus reminded him of what he'd lost. Every day, Bobby nodded sadly. The boy grew up looking more and more like Elena. Same eyes, same expressions, same way of tilting his head when he was thinking. David couldn't look at Marcus without seeing his dead wife. Marcus felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with sickening clarity. And Linda knew all this? Bobby's silence was answer enough, but Jake pressed the issue. She knew why Dad married her? She knew he was using her family to escape his guilt? Linda was grieving too, Bobby said carefully. Her first husband had died of cancer the year before. She needed stability for Jake, and David needed redemption, I guess. A chance to prove he could be a good father to someone. "Just not to me," Marcus said quietly. "He convinced himself it was better that way," Bobby continued. "That you were better off with minimal emotional attachment from him because he'd already proven he could destroy the people he loved most." The revelations painted David's emotional abandonment in a new light, not as casual cruelty, but as a deeply misguided attempt at self-punishment that had lasted 27 years. It didn't excuse the damage he'd caused, but it explained the mechanism behind it. "So Linda spent all these years protecting his secret," Sarah said, "enabling his avoidance instead of encouraging him to get help." "She thought she was protecting the family," Bobby replied. "But secrets like this, they poison everything they touch." Marcus looked around the room at the evidence of his family's buried trauma. The photos, the newspaper clippings, the journal entries that revealed the slow disintegration of his parents' marriage. His entire childhood had been shaped by events he'd never fully understood, by guilt and grief that had never been properly processed. "The question now," Jake said quietly, "is what we do with this information." Marcus stared at his mother's final journal entry, dated the day before the accident. "I love David, but I'm losing hope that we can find our way back to each other. Sometimes I think the only thing keeping us together is Marcus, and that's not fair to any of us. A child shouldn't have to be the bridge between his parents." Elena Thompson had died trying to save a marriage that was already broken, and her death had shattered what remained of her family's capacity for healthy love. But now, finally, the truth was out in the open. The question was whether truth, after 27 years of lies and avoidance, could still set them free. Marcus's hand traced the edge of Dr. Nguyen's tissue box as he struggled to articulate the revelation that had been consuming him for days. The therapist's office felt smaller today, filled with the weight of everything he'd discovered about his family's buried trauma. I keep thinking about the word real, Marcus said finally. When my father called Jake his real son, I thought he meant Jake was more worthy of love, but now I understand he meant Jake was safe to love. Dr. Nguyen leaned forward slightly, her expression encouraging him to continue. My father wasn't choosing Jake over me because Jake was better. He was choosing Jake because loving Jake didn't trigger his guilt about my mother's death. Elena grabbed the wheel because I was being reckless, and when she did, we swerved into oncoming traffic. The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. His mother's death, the defining trauma of his childhood, the loss that had shaped everything that came after, had been caused by his father's recklessness. She died because of me, David continued, his voice hollow. And every time I look at you, I see her eyes, her expressions, her way of tilting her head when she's thinking. You're so much like her. It's like having a ghost in the house. So, you replaced her, Marcus said, understanding flooding through him with sickening clarity. You married Linda 2 years later and adopted her son. Created a new family where you didn't have to face reminders of what you destroyed. It wasn't like that. It was exactly like that. Marcus's voice carried a devastated certainty. You couldn't handle the guilt of looking at me, so you invested all your emotional energy into Jake. The son who didn't remind you of your failure. The son who didn't carry the face of the woman you killed. David flinched as if he'd been struck. Don't say that. Why not? It's the truth, isn't it? You've spent 27 years punishing me for existing, for having the audacity to look like the mother you took away from me. I tried to be a good father. To Jake. Marcus's voice broke with the weight of decades of suppressed pain. You tried to be a good father to Jake. I was just the inconvenient reminder of your biggest mistake, tolerated but never truly wanted. David stood abruptly, his face flushed with anger and shame. I won't listen to this. You don't understand the guilt I've carried. Your guilt is not my responsibility, Marcus shouted. I was 8 years old. I lost my mother, and instead of gaining comfort from my father, I got emotional abandonment because my existence was inconvenient for your healing process. I did the best I could. Your best was pathetic. The words came out cold and final. Your best was creating a hierarchy of sons where one got love and the other got leftovers. Your best was making me feel like a stranger in my own family, for 27 years. David moved toward the door, his movements jerky with suppressed emotion. I came here to discuss business, to try to repair this situation, but if you're going to be unreasonable... Unreasonable? Marcus followed him to the door. I'm finally being reasonable. I'm finally seeing this situation clearly instead of making excuses for your emotional cowardice. David's hand was on the doorknob when he turned back, his face a mask of wounded pride and defensive anger. When you're ready to stop playing the victim and return to the real world, you know where to find me. I know exactly where to find you, Marcus replied quietly. The same place you've always been. Emotionally unavailable and constitutionally incapable of taking responsibility for the damage you've caused. The door slammed behind David, leaving Marcus alone in the sudden silence. He sank onto his couch, his hands shaking as the full impact of the conversation hit him. His father had been driving the night his mother died. The accident that had shaped his entire childhood, that had left him motherless and emotionally abandoned, had been caused by the man who was supposed to protect and care for him. And rather than dealing with his guilt and grief in healthy ways, David had channeled all his parental energy into a replacement family, while treating his biological son like a living reminder of his worst moment. For the first time since the retirement party, Marcus felt something beyond hurt and confusion. He felt anger, pure, justified anger at the decades of emotional neglect that now had an explanation, but no excuse. His father hadn't just failed to love him properly. He'd actively chosen to withhold love as a way of managing his own guilt, and that choice had stolen Marcus's entire childhood, adolescence, and young adulthood. But now Marcus knew the truth. And the truth, devastating as it was, might finally set him free. Marcus's hand trembled as he spread the documents across his dining table like pieces of a puzzle he'd never known existed. 3 days had passed since his father's devastating revelation, and the need to understand the complete truth had consumed him with the intensity of a fever. October 15, 1992, Sarah read from the police report she'd helped him obtain through a contact at the county courthouse. Single vehicle accident, Highway 34, approximately 9:47 p.m. Driver, David Thompson, age 32. Passenger, Elena Thompson, age 30. Cause of accident listed as loss of vehicle control during inclement weather. Ooh. The clinical language couldn't capture the horror of what had actually happened. A family argument that had escalated until his mother grabbed the steering wheel in desperation, sending their car into oncoming traffic. Marcus studied the diagram showing the crash site, trying to imagine his parents' final moments together. There's no mention of the argument in the official report, Sarah continued, her finger tracing the typed lines. But look at this witness statement. She pointed to a paragraph from a truck driver who'd been traveling behind them. States he observed apparent distress in the vehicle before the accident. Saw what appeared to be animated discussion between the occupants. Marcus leaned back in his chair, processing the gap between the sanitized official version and the messy reality his father had finally revealed. He covered it up, made it seem like a weather-related accident instead of admitting his recklessness, caused it. The insurance investigation was more thorough, Sarah said, pulling out another document. They interviewed your father extensively. Look at this note from the claims adjuster. Marcus read the handwritten margin note. Subject appears to be experiencing significant guilt regarding circumstances of accident. Repeated statements about, should have been more careful, and, if only I hadn't. Recommending psychological evaluation before settlement. Did he get the evaluation? Sarah shook her head. The claim was settled 3 weeks later. Standard payout for accidental death. No further investigation required. The methodical accumulation of facts felt like archaeological work, excavating the buried truth of his family's foundational trauma. But Marcus needed more than official documents. He needed to understand who his mother had been beyond the idealized memory his father had allowed him to keep. I want to see her things, Marcus said suddenly. Dad must have stored them somewhere. An hour later, they stood in the climate-controlled storage unit David had been paying for since 1993. Marcus's voice carried a new understanding, painful but clarifying. I've spent 35 years trying to earn something that was never about my worthiness in the first place. How does that realization feel? Marcus considered the question, carefully. Liberating in a way. Devastating in another. Because it means all those years of trying to be good enough. All the sacrifices I made thinking they would finally make him see me. None of it was ever going to work. Because the problem wasn't with you. No. The problem was that I looked like the woman he killed. The words came out flat, matter of fact, stripped of the emotional charge they'd carried for weeks. Every time he looked at me, he saw his failure. So he stopped looking. Across town, Jake sat in his childhood living room, watching Linda pace nervously as she rearranged throw pillows for the 3rd time. Bobby Martinez sat heavily in David's chair, looking older than his 70 years. This is a mistake, Linda insisted, her voice pitched higher than usual. David isn't ready for this kind of confrontation. The stress isn't good for his heart. His heart's been broken for 27 years, Bobby replied gruffly. Maybe it's time to figure out if it can heal. Jake checked his watch. He'll be here soon. Are you sure you can do this, Linda? Because if you're going to make excuses for him again, I'm not making excuses. Linda's voice cracked slightly. I'm trying to protect this family. From what? The truth? Jake's question hung in the air as they heard David's car in the driveway. When David entered the house, his face immediately registered suspicion at the assembled group. What's this about? It's about Elena, Jake said without preamble. It's about the accident, and the guilt you've been carrying, and the way it's destroyed your relationship with Marcus. David's face went ashen. I don't know what you think you know. We know everything, Dad. Jake's voice was gentle but firm. We found the police reports, the insurance documents, Mom's journal. We know you were driving. We know you blamed yourself. And we know you've been punishing Marcus for surviving when she didn't. The silence that followed was deafening. Linda sank onto the couch, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Bobby stared at his longtime friend with a mixture of sadness and frustration. "You don't understand," David said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "The guilt. It never goes away. Every morning I wake up and remember that I killed the woman I loved, that I made my son an orphan because I couldn't control my temper. So you decided to orphan him emotionally too?" Bobby's question was sharp with decades of suppressed anger. Back in Dr. Nguyen's office, Marcus was working through the same realization from a different angle. "I've been angry at him for not loving me enough," Marcus said. "But the truth is more complicated than that. He loved my mother so much that losing her broke something fundamental in him, and I became collateral damage in his inability to heal. That doesn't excuse the harm he caused you." "No, it doesn't. But it helps me understand that his emotional absence wasn't a verdict on my worthiness as a son. It was a symptom of his untreated trauma." Dr. Nguyen nodded. "And how does that change things for you moving forward?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "It means I can stop trying to earn something that was never mine to earn." His ability to be emotionally present was damaged by grief and guilt, not by anything I did or didn't do. Meanwhile, the confrontation in David's living room was reaching its breaking point. "I tried to be a good father to Jake because I thought maybe if I could succeed with one son, it would prove I wasn't completely broken," David admitted, his voice hollow. "But every time I looked at Marcus, I saw Elena. Her eyes, her expressions, her way of thinking. It was like having a ghost in the house." "So you created a new family where you didn't have to face that ghost," Linda said quietly. Speaking the truth she'd kept buried for 27 years. David's head snapped toward her. "You knew. You understood why I needed—" "I understood that you were a broken man who needed healing," Linda interrupted, her voice gaining strength. "What I didn't understand was that my job wasn't to protect you from facing your trauma. My job was to help you heal from it." Jake leaned forward. "And Marcus paid the price for our collective failure to address the real problem." Bobby's voice cut through the emotional tension like a knife. "The boy gave up his dreams to save your company, David. He worked himself into the ground trying to prove he was worthy of love that should have been freely given. And you let him do it because it was easier than dealing with your own pain." "I know," David whispered, his composure finally cracking. "God help me. I know what I've done to him. But I don't know how to fix it. I don't know how to look at him without seeing her." "Then get help," Jake said firmly. "Real help. Realizing the full scope of what he's lost with you." The weight of family obligation pressed against Marcus's chest like a familiar burden. For 35 years, he'd responded to these moments of crisis by setting aside his own needs to fix whatever problem threatened the family's stability. The pattern was so ingrained that he could feel himself preparing to do it again. "I'll call the city planning office," Marcus found himself saying. "I can walk them through the engineering rationale." "Actually," Jake's voice carried a new uncertainty. "Dad wants to make a public apology. To you. In front of the entire company staff. He thinks that's where the healing should start, acknowledging publicly what he's done privately." Marcus felt Sarah's hand touch his arm, a silent reminder that he had choices beyond the family's expectations. "I'll think about it," Marcus said carefully. After ending the call, he sat in silence with Sarah, watching the morning light shift across the contract that represented his potential freedom. "What are you thinking?" Sarah asked. "I'm thinking about patterns," Marcus replied slowly. "For 10 years, every time there was a crisis, I stepped in to solve it. And every time, it reinforced my role as the invisible fixer while someone else got credit for the success. But this time is different. This time I have a choice. I can solve their problem and return to the same dynamic, or I can let them figure out how to function without me." Sarah nodded, but her next question surprised him. What if there was a third option? Before Marcus could ask what she meant, another call interrupted, this time from Linda. He almost didn't answer, but something in the persistence of her attempts made him reconsider. "Marcus," Linda's voice was smaller than he'd ever heard it, stripped of its usual bustling energy. "I know you probably don't want to talk to me, but I need to say something. I'm listening. I failed you." The words came out in a rush, as if she'd been practicing them. For 27 years, I failed you. I saw how David treated you differently, and I told myself it was just his way. I convinced myself that you were strong enough to handle it, that you didn't need the attention. Marcus found himself gripping the phone tighter. But the truth is, I was protecting myself, Linda continued. I was so grateful for the stability David provided after my first husband died that I was willing to overlook anything that threatened it, including your emotional well-being. Linda, please let me finish. I enabled David's avoidance because it was easier than confronting the fact that I'd married a broken man who needed serious help. I chose my comfort over your childhood, and I will never forgive myself for that. The raw honesty in her voice was unlike anything Marcus had heard from his stepmother. For the first time, she wasn't trying to smooth things over or minimize the damage. I don't know if you'll ever be able to forgive me, Linda continued, but I want you to know that I see it now. I see what we took from you, and I'm going to spend whatever time I have left trying to make amends. After the call ended, Marcus sat staring at the contract, his mind churning through emotions he wasn't sure how to process. Third option, Sarah said quietly, returning to her earlier comment. What if you didn't have to choose between abandoning your family completely or sacrificing yourself for them again? What do you mean? Sarah pulled out her laptop and opened a document she'd apparently been working on. What if we started our own firm? You and me, equal partners. We could take on the Riverside project as consultants, solve their immediate crisis but on our terms, with proper credit, proper compensation, and clear boundaries. Marcus stared at the business plan she'd outlined. Chen and Thompson Architectural Solutions. The name alone made something inside his chest loosen. Equal billing, equal partnership, a chance to build something together rather than trying to fix something broken. We could stay in the area, Sarah continued. Be available for family healing if that's what happens, but not dependent on Thompson Construction for our livelihood or identity. The possibility felt revolutionary, a way forward that didn't require him to choose between complete estrangement and complete sacrifice. You've been thinking about this for a while, Marcus observed. I've been thinking about you, Sarah corrected. About what you need to be happy, and I don't think you need to prove yourself to your father anymore. But I also don't think you need to cut yourself off from the possibility of healing. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Through the peephole, Marcus saw David standing in the hallway, looking older and more uncertain than Marcus had ever seen him. I know you probably don't want to see me, David said when Marcus opened the door. But I was hoping. I was wondering if you might come with me to visit your mother's grave. The request was so unexpected that Marcus found himself at a loss for words. I haven't been there since the funeral, David continued, his voice shaking slightly. I couldn't face her, couldn't face the reminder of what I'd done. But Dr. Nguyen thinks it might help if I could talk to Elena about what happened, about how sorry I am, and I thought maybe you'd want to be there too. Marcus looked back at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly. An hour later, Marcus found himself standing beside his father at Elena Thompson's graveside for the first time in over 2 decades. David carried a small bouquet of white roses, the same flowers Marcus remembered from the photos of their wedding. I'm sorry, Elena, David said quietly, his voice barely audible. I'm sorry I was too angry to drive safely that night. I'm sorry I let my pride and stubbornness put you in danger. And I'm sorry for what I did to Marcus afterward. Marcus watched, his father's shoulders shake with suppressed sobs, seeing for the first time the depth of guilt David had been carrying. I thought if I could be a perfect father to Jake, it would somehow balance out my failure with you and Marcus, David continued. But all I did was create more damage. I made our son pay for my inability to handle losing you. Therapy. Whatever it takes to process the grief you've been avoiding for nearly 3 decades. Linda stood up suddenly, moving to the window that overlooked the garden she'd tended for 25 years. I enabled this, she said, her back to the room. I told myself I was being a good wife by protecting David's secrets, but I was really just protecting myself from having to deal with a truly broken family. Linda, David started. No. Let me finish. She turned back to face them, tears streaming down her face. I failed Marcus too. I saw how you treated him differently, and I told myself it was just your way. I convinced myself that he was strong enough to handle it, that he didn't need as much attention as Jake. Why? Jake's voice was pained. Why did you choose to protect Dad's comfort over Marcus's well-being? Because I was terrified, Linda admitted. Terrified that if I pushed too hard, if I demanded David face his trauma, he might break completely. And then, where would we be? Jake and I needed stability, and David provided that even if he couldn't provide emotional availability. Bobby shook his head sadly. So you all made Marcus pay the price for David's inability to heal. At the same moment, in Dr. Nguyen's office, Marcus was reaching his own conclusion. I think I understand now why forgiveness feels impossible, Marcus said. It's not just about forgiving him for the emotional neglect. It's about forgiving him for stealing my entire childhood, adolescence, and young adulthood, because he was too cowardly to face his own trauma. And where does that leave you? Marcus was quiet for a long time. I don't know yet. Understanding why he did it doesn't undo the damage. Understanding his trauma doesn't heal mine. But maybe it means I can stop making his healing my responsibility. What would that look like? It would mean accepting that he's a broken man who may never be capable of being the father I needed. And it would mean building a life that doesn't depend on his approval or recognition. Back in the living room, David was facing the same realization from the other side. I've lost him, haven't I? David asked, his voice breaking. I've spent so many years avoiding the pain of Elena's death that I've lost my son completely. Maybe, Bobby said honestly. But maybe not. Maybe there's still time to do the work you should have done 27 years ago, even if he never forgives me? Jake met his father's eyes with a steady gaze. Even if he never forgives you. Because healing isn't about earning forgiveness. It's about becoming the person you should have been all along. The room fell, silent as each person contemplated the magnitude of the changes that would be required to move forward. For the first time in 27 years, the truth was completely in the open. The question now was whether truth, painful as it was, could finally create the foundation for something healthier. Marcus's hand hovered over the contract spread across his kitchen table, the letterhead of Meridian Architectural Group crisp and official in the morning light. 3 weeks had passed since the family confrontation, and the offer to join the prestigious firm as a senior partner represented everything he'd once dreamed of: creative freedom, recognition for his talents, and complete independence from the family dynamics that had defined his adult life. It's a good offer, Sarah said, refilling his coffee cup. Better than good. They're essentially offering to fund your transition back to architecture with a guaranteed client base. Marcus studied the terms again. Meridian had been tracking his work through the construction projects where he'd collaborated with their architects over the years. They'd noticed his innovative solutions to structural challenges, his ability to bridge the gap between artistic vision and practical implementation. The position would allow him to design rather than just build, to create rather than merely execute others' visions. But, Sarah prompted, reading the hesitation in his expression. But I'd be walking away from Thompson Construction completely. From Dad, from Jake, from everything I've spent the last 10 years building. Sarah settled beside him at the table, her presence grounding as always. Is that necessarily a bad thing? Before Marcus could answer, his phone rang. Jake's name appeared on the screen, and Marcus noted the time, 7:23 a.m. His brother was calling before his hospital shift, which meant urgency. The Riverside project is in crisis, Jake said without preamble when Marcus answered. The city's threatening to pull our permits. Something about structural integrity concerns with the foundation modifications. They want to speak with the engineer who designed the solution. Marcus closed his eyes, recognizing the problem immediately. The Riverside development had required innovative foundation work due to the site's proximity to the river. He'd spent months developing a solution that would prevent flood damage while maintaining the architectural integrity of the planned buildings. They need you, Marcus, Jake continued. I've been trying to understand your notes, but the engineering, Firms we're consulting don't have the context for why you made those specific choices. Where's Dad in all this? Jake's pause was telling. In therapy. He's been going twice a week since our family meeting. Dr. Nguyen is helping him work through the grief and guilt about Mom's death. Marcus felt a flicker of something. Surprise, perhaps, or cautious hope. His father had never shown any inclination toward introspection or professional help. How's that going? Hard, Jake admitted. Really hard. He's starting to understand how his untreated trauma affected everyone around him. But Marcus, he's falling apart a little. Marcus felt something shift in his chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but recognition of genuine change. This wasn't the Jake who had basked in their father's favoritism while remaining willfully blind to its cost. The construction business isn't medicine, Marcus warned. It's physical work, long hours, difficult clients, and you'd be starting at the bottom, not as the boss's son. Good, Jake replied firmly. That's exactly what I need. Linda appeared in the doorway, carrying a tray of coffee, and looking more nervous than Marcus had seen her since the family confrontation. Over the past month, she'd begun individual therapy to address her own trauma from losing her first husband. Grief. She'd never properly processed before throwing herself into marriage with David. I wanted to be here for this, she said, setting down the tray with hands that trembled slightly. To witness Marcus finally getting what he should have had all along. The acknowledgement was simple, but Marcus recognized its significance. Linda was choosing to support him rather than protect David's comfort. A fundamental shift in family dynamics that had taken decades to achieve. There's something else we need to discuss, Marcus said, pulling out another document. Family. Traditions. We need new ones that include Mom's memory instead of avoiding it. He'd spent hours working on this with Dr. Nguyen, identifying healthy ways to honor Elena Thompson without triggering David's guilt and avoidance. Annual art fair in her name, Marcus continued. Family dinners where we share positive memories of her. Visiting her grave together on her birthday instead of pretending the date doesn't exist. David's breathing had grown shallow, but he nodded. I'd like that. I've been talking about her in therapy, and Dr. Nguyen thinks. She thinks Elena would want to be remembered with joy instead of just grief. She painted all the time when I was little, Marcus said, surprised by the memories surfacing clearly. The kitchen table was always covered with her art supplies. She'd let me help mix colors. She called you her little artist, David added quietly. Said you had her eye for composition and color. The memory felt like a gift. A piece of his mother he'd forgotten, now returned through his father's willingness to remember her with love instead of pain. Sarah moved to stand beside Marcus, her presence grounding him as the weight of these changes settled around them. We should celebrate, she said simply. All of these new beginnings deserve recognition. Bobby raised his coffee cup. To partnerships, built on respect instead of obligation. To healing that honors the past without being trapped by it, Linda added, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. Jake lifted his cup. To learning that love isn't about being perfect. It's about being willing to do better. David's hand shook slightly as he raised his coffee. To second chances that probably aren't deserved but might still be possible. Marcus looked around the room at his family. Broken, complicated, but finally committed to honest change. He thought about the partnership papers that would make him an equal owner of Thompson Construction, about the architectural firm he was building with Sarah, about the arts center that would honor his mother's memory. To choosing healing over harmony, Marcus said finally, lifting his own cup, and to building something new on the foundation of truth. As they drank their coffee together, Marcus felt something he'd never experienced in this office, a sense of belonging that wasn't based on performance or approval. For the first time in his adult life, he was fully present as himself, not as the invisible fixer or the son seeking validation. The future remained uncertain. Family healing was a process, not a destination, and there would undoubtedly be setbacks and difficult moments ahead. But for the first time, Marcus felt confident that he could navigate those challenges from a position of strength rather than desperation. He was no longer trying to earn his place in the family. He was claiming it on his own terms, with boundaries, that protected his well-being and relationships that nourished his growth. The scared, overlooked boy who had spent decades seeking his father's approval was becoming a man who knew his own worth, with or without anyone else's recognition. And, perhaps most importantly, he was building something beautiful with Sarah, something that belonged entirely to them. The architectural firm they were creating together represented more than professional partnership. It was proof that love could be collaborative rather than competitive, supportive rather than conditional. As the meeting concluded and papers were signed, Marcus looked out the window at the construction site where Thompson Construction was building its latest project. Soon, that same view would include the Elena Thompson Community Arts Center, a place where creativity would flourish in his mother's memory. The decision was made. The healing had begun. And for the first time in his life, Marcus Thompson was truly home. Part 10. The Resolution. Marcus's hand found Sarah's as they stood on the terrace of the Elena Thompson Community Arts Center, watching their engagement party unfold in the space they had designed together. 1 year had passed since the devastating retirement speech that had shattered his understanding of family, and the contrast could not have been more profound. The arts center hummed with life. Local artists displaying their work in Elena's memorial gallery, children's laughter echoing from the pottery studio, the soft sounds of a string quartet performing in the main hall. Everything was bathed in the warm October light that filtered through the skylights Sarah had insisted on, creating the sense of openness and possibility that had become the hallmark of their architectural partnership. "Your mother would be proud," Sarah said quietly, squeezing his hand. "Of the center, of you, of what this family has become." Marcus nodded, watching his father across the courtyard, as David helped an elderly artist hang her paintings. The transformation in David Thompson over the past year had been remarkable. Not just the therapy and emotional growth, but the way he carried himself. Gone was the defensive armor of success that had defined him for so long, replaced by something more genuine and infinitely more appealing. "Marcus, Sarah." Jake's voice carried across the courtyard as he approached with a woman Marcus had been looking forward to meeting. Dr. Amanda Reeves was a child psychologist Jake had met during his extended residency leave, and their relationship represented everything Jake was learning about healthy partnerships. "Amanda, these are the architects I've been telling you about," Jake said, his arm around her waist in a gesture of natural affection. "And more importantly, my brother and future sister-in-law." The introduction was easy, warm, free of the competitive undertones that had once characterized every family gathering. Jake had returned to his residency 6 months ago, but not before spending a transformative year working construction and learning to build things with his hands rather than just his intellect. The experience had humbled him in ways that had ultimately made him stronger. "Jake's told me so much about the family healing journey," Amanda said, her smile genuine. "It's remarkable what you've all accomplished." "It's been hard work," Marcus replied honestly, "but worth every difficult conversation." Linda appeared beside them, carrying a tray of hors d'oeuvres she'd prepared herself. Not because she felt obligated to manage every detail, but because she genuinely enjoyed hosting when it came from choice rather than compulsion. The past year had seen her emerge from David's shadow, pursuing her own interests in gardening and watercolor painting, developing friendships that weren't centered on managing family dynamics. "The caterers are handling the main dinner," she said, offering the tray around. "But I wanted to make something special for tonight. These are Elena's recipe for spanakopita. I found it in her journals." The gesture was perfect in its thoughtfulness. Linda had learned to honor Elena's memory as part of the family history, rather than treating her as a threat to her own position. The shift had allowed her to support both sons equally, advocating for Marcus when necessary while maintaining her loving relationship with Jake. Bobby Martinez approached their group, moving more slowly than he once had, but with eyes that sparkled with satisfaction. At 71, he'd officially retired from Thompson Construction, though he continued to serve as an advisor to both the construction company and Chen and Thompson Architectural Solutions. "Hell of a party," Bobby said, accepting a kiss on the cheek from Sarah. Elena would have loved seeing this place filled with artists and families. She always said art should be part of daily life, not something locked away in museums. "Speaking of daily life," Marcus said, "Sarah and I have an announcement to make." He looked around at the group that had become his chosen family, not just by blood, but by the conscious choice to do better, to heal, to grow together. Chen and Thompson Architectural Solutions has been offered the design contract for the new children's hospital in Portland. It's a 3-year project that will establish us as a major firm. Sarah's smile was radiant. We're going to take it, which means Marcus will be transitioning out of day-to-day operations at Thompson Construction. It's time, Marcus continued, looking at Jake. I've taught you everything I know about the business side. Dad's emotionally present in ways he never was before, and I need to follow my own dreams for once. Jake nodded, his expression serious. I'm ready. More than ready. And I promise to honor what you built here. I know you will, Marcus replied, and meant it completely. David appeared at the edge of their circle, his approach no longer carrying the weight of authority or distance that had once defined his presence. The year of therapy had transformed not just his emotional availability, but his entire way of being in the world. Family, David said simply, and friends who are family. I have something to say. Unlike the retirement party a year ago, this gathering quieted naturally, not out of obligation, but from genuine interest in what David Thompson might share. He'd learned to speak from the heart rather than from prepared remarks, and his words had gained power through their authenticity. A year ago, I stood up at my retirement party and said some things that revealed the worst of who I was as a father. David began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I hurt my son Marcus in ways that I'm still learning to understand and repair. Marcus felt Sarah's hand tighten on his, offering support he no longer desperately needed but was grateful to receive. Tonight, I want to say what I should have said then, and what I should have been saying for the past 35 years. David's eyes found Marcus in the crowd. Marcus, you are my son in every way that matters. You've shown more strength, integrity, and grace than I ever taught you. You saved our family business, but more importantly, you've saved our family itself by refusing to let us continue avoiding the truth. The words landed differently than Marcus had imagined they would. A year ago, they would have been everything he needed to hear. Now, they were simply acknowledgement of what he already knew about himself. Jake, David continued, turning to his younger son, you've grown into a man I'm proud to know. Not because of your achievements, but because of your willingness to do the hard work of understanding how our family dynamics affected everyone involved. You've taught me that love isn't about favoritism. It's about seeing each person clearly and supporting their individual journey. Jake wiped his eyes, not embarrassed by his tears. The family had learned that emotional honesty was strength, not weakness. Sarah, David said, thank you for loving my son well, and for showing all of us what a healthy partnership looks like. You've been a gift to this family in ways you may never fully realize. Linda, his voice softened as he looked at his wife, thank you for your patience during the hardest year of our marriage, for choosing growth over comfort, for supporting Marcus even when it would have been easier to maintain the status quo. Linda smiled through her own tears, reaching for David's hand. And Bobby, my oldest friend. Thank you for finally telling me truths I didn't want to hear. For risking our friendship to advocate for my son when I was too broken to see what I was doing to him. Bobby nodded gruffly, but Marcus caught the emotion in the older man's eyes. The Elena Thompson Community Arts Center represents more than just a building, David concluded. It represents our family's commitment to honoring memory through creation rather than destruction, to building something beautiful from the ashes of our mistakes. As applause filled the courtyard, Marcus felt a profound sense of completion, not the desperate validation he'd once sought, but the quiet satisfaction of having done the work necessary to heal generational wounds. Later, as the party wound down and guests began to leave, the family found themselves gathered around Elena's memorial plaque in the center's main gallery. The bronze inscription read simply, Elena Thompson, 1960-1992. Artist, mother, dreamer. Her creativity lives on in every hand that picks up a brush, every child who discovers the joy of making something beautiful. I have something to tell you all, Marcus said, looking around at the faces of the people who had learned to love him properly. Sarah and I aren't just engaged, we're also expecting a baby. The announcement brought gasps of joy and excitement, but Marcus held up a hand. "There's something I need you all to know. We're committed to breaking the cycles that damaged our family. Our child will grow up knowing they're loved unconditionally, not because of what they achieve or how they perform, but simply because they exist." David stepped forward, his eyes bright with tears. "That child will be so lucky to have you as parents. And if you'll let me, I'd like to try to be the grandfather I never learned how to be as a father." "We'll all learn together," Marcus replied. "That's what families do when they're healthy." As they stood together in the gallery surrounded by Elena's memory and the art that represented hope for the future, Marcus realized that this was what he'd been seeking all along. Not his father's approval, but a sense of belonging built on truth rather than performance. The baby would grow up in a family that had learned to communicate honestly, to set appropriate boundaries, to love without conditions. They would know their grandmother Elena through stories and art rather than through the silence that had once surrounded her memory. They would see their grandfather as a man who had done the difficult work of becoming better rather than someone who was inherently flawed. "To Elena," Sarah said, raising the sparkling cider she'd been drinking all evening. "To Elena," the family echoed, "and to the love that continues." As they toasted, Marcus caught a glimpse of their reflection in the gallery window. A family that had learned to choose healing over harmony, honesty over peace, and love over dysfunction. It wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but it was real, and it was theirs, and it was enough. The Elena Thompson Community Arts Center would continue to serve the community for generations. Just as the family healing they'd accomplished would ripple forward through the child Sarah carried, and any children that might follow. The cycles of emotional neglect and avoidance had been broken through conscious choice and hard work. Marcus Thompson had finally found his way home. Not to the place he'd started, but to the family they'd all chosen to become. And in that choosing, in that daily commitment to do better and be better, he'd discovered that love wasn't something you earned through performance. It was something you created through courage, honesty, and the willingness to keep growing together. The stars appeared overhead as the last guests departed, and Marcus and Sarah stood hand in hand in the courtyard of the building they'd designed together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to practice the healthy patterns they'd worked so hard to establish. But tonight, surrounded by family that had learned to love him properly and pregnant with a child who would know unconditional love from birth, Marcus Thompson was exactly where he belonged. The real son had finally come home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.